two brilliant people, lovely, lovely people, and they worked so hard to put this on, and also the rest of the backroom staff. So please put your hands together for Anthony Becker and also don't sleep, do they? They never sleep for weeks beforehand, so big sleep this week. You can chill out and take it easy. Okay, just before we get into our last talk, we've got some awards to do. Okay, so our first award goes to the first British Exopolitics Awards for recognition of achievements in the fields of ufology, UFO disclosure and exopolitics. The UK award goes to, well, for raising the profile of ufology and this big hit, the Rendlesham incident with the public. Please put your hands together for the winner of the UK award, Gary Hasseltine. Say a few words. Thank you, public. Thank you, listeners.
We kept that secret from there. I didn't have a clue. There's very rarely times when I'm lost for words. In Washington in 2010, I went out for what I just thought was a great honour to speak at the Washington Press Club. And then suddenly at the evening, like an evening reception do, suddenly they're doing these awards. And Steve Massey starts talking, and I'm thinking, that sounds a bit familiar. And then I start going dry, and then all of a sudden, you won an award. And I've never won an award for years and years other than for sports when I was younger. So that was a great shock. I am absolutely delighted and honoured to have received this award. What I would like to say, on a true note, is I know that there's just been a dedication to Anthony Beckett and Rachel for obviously all the hard work, but I want to actually give my personal thanks to Anthony Beckett, because for the simple reason is ufology in the UK is on its knees through a combination of reasons, the main one being Graham Birdsall dying, and we were put back 10 to 15 years, in my opinion, by the death of Graham Birdsall and the withdrawal of UFO magazine. I stepped into the UFO Monthly straight after he died. There's been various attempts to get into print, but one thing has been needed, somebody to carry on the conferences. And Anthony Beckett, from my perspective, came out of the woodwork, never heard of him, 4 years ago, and this guy deserves a medal. So please put your hands together.
The speakers over the weekend have no idea about the fact that we're doing this. Okay, we've got one more award to do, and the International Award. Don't think you have to be Einstein to guess who's won the International Award. The International Award for his relentless pursuit of the truth via the US Freedom of Information Act, and for being a Canadian and showing the Americans how it's done.
Thanks. That's it. Thank you very much. Well, I sort of sometimes regret having seen my first UFO, and this sort of makes it worthwhile that, you know, I sort of gave up my life to do this. And it gives some recognition, because in ufology, sometimes it's a long, hard road, and we work at it an awful lot. And I am deeply indebted to Anthony and Rachel for bringing me in, for you know, picking me up and treating me like some sort of star. And I can't say enough. I'd do this again anytime. I just think this is great, and the amount of people that you move it from one venue to another, you get it. I know, because I speak at a lot of conferences in the United States, and I know absolutely, for a fact, how hard these people work. This is not easy, putting these things together, and the nerves of trying to make the bills fit at the other end. And a lot of times you don't realize that a lot of these conferences lose money. People put it up themselves, and I'm indebted to them. And I know this audio type stuff that when you're doing the PowerPoint with the audio and the video and stuff like this, they have all the technical people. And in this case, I mean, not too many people helping. You got sort of a two-person show, and I'm deeply honored to be here and impressed at what's gone on here. I've spoken at a lot of conferences, and this is one of the better conferences I've spoken at. So thank you very much. And
Set back, enjoy Grant Cameron, everybody.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm also indebted to Anthony for letting me make a second speech. I can talk endlessly. I have all sorts of subjects. This particular subject, when I asked Anthony if I could do a second one, this is a subject that's only come up in the last couple of weeks, and this started with this story of the CIA, 40-year CIA officer. And I was dragged into this by Robbie Graham, who's from the UK, and I think he spoke here last year, didn't he? And he's sort of the media expert inside the UFO community. He's doing his PhD on the UFO involvement in Hollywood, all the Hollywood movies and how UFOs get dragged into this. And he's now putting out a book, which I think is going to be out within the year, on UFOs in Hollywood. He's a brilliant fellow. What we're going to do tonight is disclosure. This is an idea that I've had for a lot of years. It's been on my website. If you go to my website, presidentialufo.com, and you look at it, I think it's called Glimpses of Disclosure, or no, it's a disclosure section in there. I haven't even updated this thing for 10 years. It's been on my website for 10 years. I've always believed that there is a method to dropping little hints and telling us what's going on. Hadn't worked on the site. I have not updated this stuff that's on my website, and there's quite a few sections. It'll go year by year to tell you different stories of what they've done to try to lead us along and tell us what's going on. So after 10 years of not updating it, Robbie Graham came to me and he said, well, there's this CIA guy who's come out, and this is important. And I went, oh, okay, whatever. You know, I'm busy doing the Falcon story, which I'll talk about a bit tonight, this other CIA guy. And so Robbie says, well, no, I've been following this guy for years. This is an important story. He went on coast to coast. So I said, okay, Robbie, I'll go. And I go on the website, and I listened to this, and I was just floored, because I realized the significance of this guy. And what this is equivalent to give you an idea, this guy coming forward, this is equivalent to a guy from MI5, MI6, coming forward on the BBC, a high-ranking guy in military intelligence in the UK, coming forward and saying, yeah, Roswell, Rendlesham was real, it was ET, we've got the bodies, we got the craft. That's what is equivalent, because basically, Chase Brandon, who is, well, first let me highlight it by saying this. The White House came out with this statement. I played this yesterday. They came out with this statement last November and basically said the U.S. government has no evidence that any life exists outside our planet or that extraterrestrial presence has contacted or engaged any member of the human race. And that came from the science advisor to President Obama. So that's an official White House statement. That's not some guy talking off the top of his head. This is an official White House statement. So then when Brandon comes forward, it's suddenly completely the opposite. They're saying there's no evidence of UFOs, and suddenly this guy from the CIA, and you'll see he's 25 years as a clandestine agent. He described a clandestine agent as someone who steals and lies and steals for the American government. So if there's a CIA guy in the room today, nobody's going to know who he is. His identity is going to be false, what he's doing is going to be false, and he's basically there to get material that normally wouldn't be given to him by a foreign government. So this is how they define a clandestine agent. So here's Chase Brandon, who spent 25 years of his life just lying and stealing for the U.S. government, and then he becomes 10 years as the media spokesman for the CIA, because they were upset that the CIA was being treated badly in movies and documentaries. So they got their own guy to go in there and say to the producer, well, if you want us to help you explain what the CIA is really about. So this was his job, to sort of smooth the edges and tell people how the CIA operated, so they'd get a good view in terms of documentaries, movies, get it right, don't make us into a bunch of bad guys and this sort of stuff. So he spent that, and then for the last 5 years, he says quite clearly in the interviews he's done, and he's only done 4 interviews. He did one overnight. He's done 4 interviews, and he basically says that you really don't quit the CIA. We want to help out. So basically, for the last 5 years, he's been under contract to the CIA. So for 40 years, this guy's been with the CIA. Now, what he did, and it started on June the 23rd, Robbie Graham had actually, they had a conversation. There was another researcher involved, had actually had a conversation with him before, and they knew that he was going to drop this Roswell bomb on the air, or that he was going to do something. They didn't realize it was going to be as open and overt as the way he did it. So it goes on Coast to Coast, and how many people have listened to Coast AM? Okay, a lot of people. Coast to Coast AM is the biggest radio station in North America. Basically, it's an all-night station where the UFO crazy people listen to it, and all the people who work overnight, and the people who can't sleep. My mother always tells me, oh, I was listening to Coast. I was up in the middle of the morning, and this guy was on, he was talking about this or whatever. It's a 4-hour show. I've been on it a few times. It's a long show to have to do. And basically, every city in North America, in Canada and the United States, usually the major radio station in the city carries Coast to Coast. So they have 10, 15, 20 million people listening. This is a major, major event. So this is where he drops this. He doesn't go to some local newspaper. He goes to this major, major national radio station. And then the second interview he does, he goes to Huffington Post. And Huffington Post is a big internet thing in the United States. And it gets like 1.5 million hits for the first 4 or 5 days it was up. It was unbelievable. There was 4,000 comments on this article. That was his second one. The third one he did for BBC, and I'll explain why he went to BBC. So he did 3, and then last night he did one with Bill Burns, who runs UFO magazine. And he goes on to this Coast to Coast, 15 million, whatever people listening, and he tells this story. He says, well, I was at the historic intelligence place where they keep all the intelligence collection at the Langley, the CIA headquarters, and I was in there and I was walking around by myself. He said, you've got to be escorted. Everybody has to be escorted, but one time I was by myself, which, you can sort of sense that he's telling a story, and he comes across this Roswell box. And he said it was the only one he looked at, and he pulled it down, and he opened it up, and then he said, what I saw inside the box, I will not talk about what I saw inside the box. What I saw confirmed to me that Roswell was real, and there was bodies. And then he ends the story, and he goes on talking about other sort of stuff. And of course, this thing just takes off. I mean, here's a 40-year guy for the CIA, and my importance, because I work with the presidential stuff, I know that the CIA does not work for the CIA. The CIA, and he described this, works for people at 60,000 feet. So the people at 60,000 feet is the president, the executive branch, the committees for House and Senate for intelligence, and for very high-level government people, and they're providing material. So if they say they need intelligence on the United Kingdom on whatever subject, that's what they get tasked with. They do what they're told. They don't go out and sell coffee, they don't sell cars, they don't decide to do stupid things. They're doing what they're told to do. Therefore, when Chase Brandon comes out, and that's why this is important, when Chase Brandon comes out, the CIA has approved it. A CIA guy does not go on a national radio show with 15 million people and suddenly say, after the president has come out and said, we have no evidence of ET, go on a national radio show with 15 million people and then say, I saw a box inside Langley headquarters that says that Roswell was for real. And that's the importance of the story. So he's doing it with, I say, there's not one chance in 10 million that he went on that show and the CIA didn't know. What he's claiming to be doing is promoting a book, and the book that he has is called the Christic Conundrum. Hang on. Robbie was going to come here today, and these are his slides from the beginning here. Yeah, well, my computer went down 3 weeks ago after I took this story, and I had a computer tech, and after three times, he still couldn't get it up. Everything kept disappearing and stuff. So Brandon had done this, and I say he has to have White House approval, because whatever happens at the CIA, the president is responsible for. If the president is basically the guy where the buck stops. So if something happens, for example, if you see right now Obama's under attack for disclosing classified information in terms of the drones and the hacking of the Iranian computers. If CIA leaks something, they go to the president and say, well, the president ordered the CIA to do it, because the CIA doesn't work for themselves. They do what they're told by people above them. So it's very important that I say that he wouldn't go on a show by himself, and that he would have to have White House approval. Something this major, for some guy to come out after the White House has put out a statement that we don't have any UFO stuff, and to then say the CIA has a box that says this is for real, and there's bodies and all this sort of stuff, and that's why it's so terribly significant. Now here's a slide that shows that he also works for BAE Systems, UK, and that's why he did the British interview. And he's a senior intelligence guy for them, and he's still interacting with the CIA. So the interesting thing about this is yesterday I played a clip of a woman that had, and I'll play it a little bit later again, Catherine Austin Fitts. And you remember the clip where she says, I was contacted by John Peterson at the Arlington Institute, and he wanted me to work on this program. And she was a Bush administration official. She was an economist. She had run HUD for the Bush administration, knew nothing about UFOs, nothing. She just got called into this program. And so she kept asking John, well, what are we doing, John? What's the gist of what are we doing here? And he said, well, you know, we're trying to do a program for the Undersecretary of the Navy to tell the Navy what it's like to live in a world where aliens live and exist among us. And then she said, well, John, I don't really know that aliens, exist and live among us. And that's when he said, well, you want to have lunch with some aliens? And so, of course, she figured this was a setup and basically ended up pulling out of it. The people that she was talking about, she was talking about generals, admirals. She was called in at the Arlington Institute. She was there with James Woolsey, who was he was on the board. He was the CIA director first CIA director for Bill Clinton. There was John Peterson, and there was this guy. And this guy had a big, huge company a computer company, Joe Firmage, and he sold out the company, and he got very interested in UFO technology, back engineering technology. He sat on that same board that Catherine Austin Fitts was brought onto this board, where they're talking about this alien thing. And what's of significance here, he says, or this was told to me, that he exchanged hundreds of emails with BAE Project Green Glow. So Brandon is working for BAE, and they have this Green Glow project, which is an anti-gravity program. And because Firmage is interested, there's hundreds of emails go between him and BAE Systems. He's trying to find out about this program. Now, yesterday I told you a story that I'll repeat again. I talked about the Canadian government, that Wilbur Smith had run this program, and that he was getting these messages from aliens, and one of them had come from some of them were coming from this operator. And he gets the phone call one Saturday morning, and the operator says they're running this anti-gravity experiment. So they're running the anti-gravity experiment, and what it is, they had two motors, and they had this plate moving at very high revs. And the operator says, APA says, shield the experiment. They build the wall, the thing explodes, the ceramic magnets flying all over the place. So they're using a spinning plate. Here we have this board, and we have BAE Systems that Brandon was working on Green Glow. So what is Green Glow? I'll read it from the article. BAE's anti-gravity research There are scientists in Finland who say that they've detected anti-gravity over a surface of a spinning superconducting disk. Exactly what Smith was doing, exactly what Smith was saying that the aliens were teaching him to do in the 1950s. Suddenly, BAE Systems has got exactly the same thing. They're taking a highly a rotating magnetic field, and they've done the experiment where they put the weight in the middle, and it loses weight. Then we find out that Boeing is also doing the same thing. Their program was called GRASP. Same thing. Rotating magnetic field, weight, the weight would be reduced. NASA was running the same thing, all going back to Wilbur Smith in 1950. And Wilbur Smith's son and his wife both told me that the vast majority of the books, this new science book that I showed you yesterday, that Smith said had been given to him by the aliens, most of the copies were sold in the Scandinavian countries, Finland, where this comes from, and in the Soviet Union. So the idea had gone, and now it's gone full circle, and now everybody's working on this thing that Wilbur Smith was working on in the 1950s, and Brandon is tied into this. So it's just a kind of an interesting little sidelight. And here's this is the Finland experiment. You can see here the weight, and they're using the sort of the superconducting stuff, which Smith didn't have back in the 50s, but it's basically the same idea. Robbie Games' perspective is the same as mine. He says there's no chance that he's doing this for money. He's got this cryptic book called Cryptic Conundrum, and it's a science fiction book, and it's basically a guy, which is supposed to be Chase Brandon, and here's this guy uncovers Roswell, and what he says, I think I've got the line coming up here. It's something you should remember as I go through all these different examples of other things besides Chase Brandon. It's a limited hangout. Here's the thing here. Brandon's talking about the book, and he wants the book to be read as fact disguised as fiction. So this is what the whole plan is. My whole lecture is going to be about this, how you take the real thing and put fiction around it. And here's Brandon talking. He talks about, this is on the interview overnight. And here's two things. I'm going to play it twice because I think it's so important that you listen to what he says here.
One of Francis Bacon says, truth is so hard to tell, it sometimes seems fiction to make it plausible. The book is a really entertaining read. If you just read the lines, I think if you read between the lines, you might get something else out of it.
Okay, so he's basically saying, read between the lines when you read my book. The truth is in there. And he actually says the book went, this Cryptic Conundrum went through CIA review 3 times. And that they wanted stuff taken out, they wanted stuff changed. And what they're doing is they're protecting the classified material, the names of people and operations, methods, all this kind of stuff. They're changing it. So he's saying, read between the lines, and he's also talking about this Bacon quote. And I'll play it again here.
One from Francis Bacon says, truth is so hard to tell, it sometimes seems fiction to make it plausible. The book is a really entertaining read. If you just read the lines, I think if you read between the lines, you might get something else out of it.
So when he's talking about this Bacon quote, he's talking about ufology. This story is so complex and so massive that the way you have to tell it is through fiction. You can't just drop it into people's lap because it's so complex and so massive a story. And he keeps repeating this Bacon quote. I've heard him say it a number of times. So let's go on. And what I'm going to do, and you can make up your own mind when the lecture's over, all I'm going to do is go through history. And I'm going to go show you. Because what basically has happened, give you an example. Everybody says that the British are disclosing. I say, no, the British aren't disclosing. They're doing exactly the opposite. What the British have done is closed the UFO desk. And they're saying, we are no longer involved in UFOs. We don't believe there's any national security implications. We don't believe there's any ETs. We're closing it. We're stopping investigation. This is exactly what the CIA did in 1953 with the Robinson panel. They said the CIA is out of UFOs. Have nothing to do with it. In 1969, an important moment. The U.S. Air Force pulled out of Blue Book. They said, no national security, no ETs, not interested, we're out of the business, shutting the program down. This is what's important. So if you have it shut down in Britain and there, so if somebody comes to Gary or something and suddenly says, I'm from the government, I'm going to tell you what happened at Rendlesham Forest, and starts leaking stuff to them, then we got a problem. Because if you're either in the business or you're out of the business. And the U.S. government says they're out of the business. So all the examples I'm going to show you are people who are saying we're not involved. And I'm going to show you that they are involved. And that indicates a cover-up, but they're doing it, they're actually on our side. They're actually trying to get this stuff out and trying to control the cover-up at the same time. But you can decide that on your own as we go through. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Oh, here's this poll. This is a poll I put out about Chase Brandon on the internet. I don't know if you can read the numbers there. I put down, is Chase Brandon telling the truth as he knows it? And that won. It got 37% of the vote. And they're all wrong because the right answer is the second one. Chase Brandon is telling a fictional version of how he knows about Roswell. And it only got 22%. It came in third place. Chase Brandon was given orders by the CIA to disinform ufologists. And that only got 24%. Chase Brandon made up the Roswell story to sell books. Only 18% believed it. And as for Chase Brandon just being some crazy CIA guy who believes in UFOs, absolutely nobody voted for that. Nobody believed that. Here's a CIA letter we sent. There's Robbie Graham and Matthew Alford, Victor Vigiani, who's a public relations type guy in Canada, myself. We sent this letter to the CIA because we realized the significance of some CIA guy coming out and suddenly saying Roswell's real and there's bodies and stuff like that. And it's like, I'll give you an example. I worked at a university in management, and my senior manager, we had a problem with an employee. And I know this is for real. So we had a problem with an employee, and the employee went to the newspaper. And my boss thought he had the gift of the gab, and so the newspaper contacted him and said, we want to do an interview. And he said, yeah, sure, come on down. And so the woman came in, and I'm going, oh, no, this is not good, you know. And but the boss, what are you going to do? And then she puts the tape recorder down on the desk. She says, can I tape? Oh, yeah, sure, you know. So anyway, he sits there for half an hour, and he's talking, and and he's just burying himself. I'm thinking, because I know that you can't do this. Anyway, he phones up Human Resources after the thing is over, and he basically tells them what happened. And they said, you did what? You gave an interview to the paper? You can't speak on behalf of the University of Manitoba? And that's the point. If you're in the CIA, you can't, because you're in the CIA, suddenly step outside the CIA and tell everybody what's going on in the CIA. Only people who speak on behalf of the CIA can speak on behalf of the CIA. You can't just go because you work at the CIA and talk to the media. And my boss for 2 days was running around saying, we're going to get fired, we're going to get... And I'm thinking, I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking to myself, we're going to get fired? I mean, I didn't agree to the interview. And I knew right away, as soon as she turned on the tape recorder, this was going to be trouble. And anyway, so this is the basic thing. And so we sent the letter to the CIA. There was 2 British, 2 Canadians, and we sent the letter to the CIA, and I kept saying to Robbie, I said, Robbie, don't you think we should get an American on here? Sound like we're like a bunch of spies, you know, we're trying to find out stuff from the CIA. And there was some British, Canadian, or Americans we offered, and they wouldn't sign the letter. So we sent the letter, and basically, in the letter, we basically request the things I've mentioned to you. Brandon's interview on Coast to Coast, was it subject to prior approval? If he's got this little book that's going to sell 10,000 copies, if he has to put that through the CIA 3 times, how can he go on a 15 million listeners and without any approval? He has to have approval. So we asked the question, did you approve him going on Coast to Coast? And we said, is there classified material? Is there legal penalties? We asked, is Mr. Brandon still under contract with the CIA in any capacity? We've learned since he is. Then we asked, is there any way that we can look at the files that he's talking about? Is there a communication policy? We're asking, do you have a policy about people going out and saying this kind of stuff that would govern what he did or what he should have done or this sort of stuff? And is there avenues for public verification of Brandon's claims? So we send this letter, and of course they write back, and I predicted this is exactly what they would say. Our historians have found nothing in the agency's holdings to corroborate Mr. Brandon's specific claims. The CIA has fielded numerous inquiries related to the UFOs over the previous years, and the definite account of the agency's roles is in this 1997 study they refer to, which I'll talk about later. So basically, this is what they do. They take the story, they put the story out. They pull the story back, and then they go to the company policy. So that's what's going to happen in Britain if you get a leak. It's going to go out, it's going to get pulled back, you're going to go to the UK and say, oh, this security guy said this guy said that, and they're going to say, this is our policy, the US, or the United Kingdom, Department of Defense, is not interested in UFOs, it's not a national security, and that's what they're going to do. They're going to go back to the policy line, and that's what the CIA did. They say, we just can't verify. They're not calling him a liar, they're not saying he's true, they're just saying we couldn't verify. Billy Cox was a reporter who'd done numerous UFO stories, one of the few reporters to do UFO stories, actually tracked the archivist down. Said, what about this? Did you look? Where did you look? All this sort of stuff. Because basically, they have to talk to Brandon. Not only does he have to have approval before he goes out to talk to 15 million people, but after it comes down, we said to them, did Brandon have authorization? And so they have to, what they have to do, they have to go to coast. They got to listen to the audio. What did he say? Then they're going to phone him up. He works for the CIA. They're going to phone him up and say, well, what did you say? Why did you say it? We had no indication. So we're trying to find out, did Brandon talk to them after? Did they talk to him? Did he get reprimanded? Or did they say, good little boy, you did exactly what we told you to do? And we couldn't get any answers. So this is, you'll see in all these examples, this is what they do. They'll put a story out, pull it back, go to the company policy. Or they'll put a story out which they know has a bad witness or has a bad part of the story. It has, and I call it a trapdoor story. The trapdoor opens, something goes wrong with the story, and everybody says, ah, it's a hoax, and everybody goes on to the next story, and the truth was in there. The witness gets killed, and because of something was wrong with them, and the story gets out, but everybody just goes on to the next story, which is exactly what happened with the Brandon story. He's been on the radio 3 times, and the main guy who did it was Lee Spiegel, who did the Huffington Post story. He writes the story, gets 1.5 million hits, and because he's a journalist, I talked about this yesterday, journalists are no good because journalists have to go on to the next story. 3 days later, he's off and doing the British story about the release of the documents. And everybody's forgotten about the Brandon story. Media is like a 3-day thing, and anybody who has a website knows that. You can get a big story on your website, you're going to get like 15,000 hits one day, second day it'll be 7,000, third day it'll be 3,000, and fourth day it's down to about 50 people, and within about 2 weeks, nobody's reading it anymore. It's a basic thing where you get it out, and they sit back and wait, and everybody just calms down and goes back to their regular business, and they're putting out this story. So let me go through the different examples. This is one I want to sort of counter. A lot of people will say to me, this is just disinformation. They're just doing this to throw everybody off. There's what, 60 people in this room, 50 people in this room? What, are we a big threat? Nobody cares about us. And this is what Jacques Vallée said. Something does not make much sense here. Why would someone in Washington, D.C. mount a disinformation effort if the only result is to confuse members of the UFO research community, which is a very small group without much influence over the public at large? You and I aren't going to do anything. Nobody's really listening to us. So why would they spend all this time to disinform us? They're not disinforming us. We are no threat. They are leaking a story. So this is Jacques Vallée, was a major researcher in the United States. He had that, and I agree with this. There's no way this is disinformation. Yesterday I revealed my characters. Today I'm going to reveal the characters I'm going to talk about today. These are the main people. The guy, I mentioned him yesterday, he was won the National Security Award. His name was Arthur Lundahl. He worked, if you are familiar with the Blue Books, Robertson panel study. He's the guy in 1953 for the CIA who did all the analysis on the UFOs and the films that were analyzed by the CIA. He did all the analysis. He ran the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which handled all the spy photographs, all the U-2 photographs, SR-71 spy photographs. Very high level position, very secretive building. He was also known as the guy who ran, and it's got different names, the Phenomenology Desk, which Brandon refers to this phenomenology, which is not just UFOs, psychic phenomena, remote viewing, everything related to mind and all this kind of stuff. So he ran what was called the Phenomenology Desk, or the Weird Desk, or the UFO Desk. He was the first guy who ran it from 1953 up till about 1969, Arthur Lundahl. The second guy took over for him. His name is Dr. Kit Green. He's still around. He's still talking. If you see some of my articles, I'll quote him sometimes. He ran the Weird Desk, the UFO Desk from, or he's the Keeper of the Weird, was what he was called, the Keeper of the Weird, from 1969 to 1983. And then this guy here, who is the guy that loves it. He knows I'm following him around. He knows other people are writing articles about him, and he just loves it. This is the top scientist in the CIA. His name is Dr. Ronald Pandolfi. He's a very high-level guy. He actually worked for the Office of National Intelligence, which was created after 9/11, and it's above the CIA, and it is to sort of get all the agencies, get all the material, all the different agencies, so they're not all divided, and they're really the only role that they have is to brief the president. It's the president's sort of personal advisor on intelligence. And according to one source said that what he was providing for this presidential advisor was technical intelligence that would be used to detect and track UFO activity. And I'm going to go through some of the stuff this guy's put out, and he's just dropping stuff in the UFO community all the time. And the whole point is, if you're not involved, why would you drop this stuff? In Canada, you guys are going to be in the same situation we are in Canada. In Canada, in 1978, they dropped all the files, the same as they're doing here in Great Britain. I've been in UFOs for 37 years. I've been in Canada. I could not tell you, not even close. I would not know who has the files, who's interested. It appears like nobody's interested, and that's the whole point. If you get out of it, you get out of the public relations problem with UFOs, but then why would you suddenly start talking to people? And you're going to see that this happen. You get out of the thing, and then you suddenly start going and leaking stuff to people when you say you're not involved. So Ronald Pandolfi does this all the time. He's just famous for this. And if you go to if you study him, put his name in there, you'll see an awful lot of weird stuff that this guy does. And he gets away with it. He can put it out there, and I'll go through some of the things. This thing all sort of started back maybe as far as 1949. It was called the Adam Commission. And this was a commission that sort of determined that public opinion in the UFO thing was important. So they created this Adam Commission. I have some problems as to whether this actually existed because I studied the presidents, and I tried to find this Philip, whatever the guy's name is, Philip Keaton. Doesn't exist. He's not an aide to Truman. He's not even on the list of anybody that even worked in the White House. So I'm a little suspicious. So I'll start a little bit later. 1956. Now, you got to put this in perspective. This is still before the Air Force gets out of UFOs. So it's not really clandestine. They're helping. They're trying to get this stuff out. There's a major UFO movie that's put out in the United States called UFO. This is 1956. And three of the top Blue Book people that ran the U.S. Air Force program, Chop, Fournet, and Ruppel, worked on this thing. They helped them. They analyzed stuff and gave them advice on how to set this thing up. So they actually helped put this UFO documentary out in 1956. Walt Disney. This is one that I have on my website. I've had up for quite a while. Walt Disney was a very powerful guy inside the U.S. government. He used to do documentaries during World War II for the U.S. military on syphilis and all sorts of stuff. And he was also an informant for the FBI. And he was contacted in 1956. This is the guy that told the story. Ward Kimball told the story in 1979, and unfortunately, he told it, and nobody taped the lecture. Nobody got a video of the lecture. But the story he told was that Walt Disney was contacted by the U.S. government in 1956, and he was asked to do a documentary to help acclimatize the American people to the fact that flying saucers were here. Disney agreed to do it. They said they were going to give you a bunch of film. We're going to give you to stick in the documentary. So Disney started working, and this is Kimball telling the story. And they had 9 animators who drew all the major animators who drew all the Disney stuff. And Ward Kimball's famous one was Jiminy Cricket. That was his character that he created. So they have 9 animators, and Ward Kimball is very interested in UFOs. He's one of these 9 animators. So he's a very powerful guy in the Disney organization. And he says that Disney worked on the documentary, and then when it came time to put the film in, the government suddenly pulled it out and said, we can't provide the film. Disney did put out the documentary. He put out a documentary without the film. And that's what I said. You put it out, you pull it back. And the story gets out, and you go on to the next one. This is another one that happened, and this one's kind of iffy. I'm not even, because the CIA tells one story and everybody else tells a different story. This is a guy in 1952, took a video. He worked for a TV station in the United States, and he was contacted by the CIA claiming to be Air Force. They were dressed up as Air Force, and so he handed over this film thinking he was handing over the Air Force, and suddenly they discovered later on he's trying to get the film back, and he never did get the film back. They gave him, CIA says they gave back 7 photographs, but the film was actually sued for by Ground Saucer Watch in the 1970s to get this film back, and then they've never got the film back. The CIA, they found out the CIA had it, and then people started writing to the CIA to get the film back, and never got it back. But they had these guys coming as Air Force officers, which happened in a second case. This is Leon Davidson. This is another one of these contact cases. This happened in Chicago in about 1955. A Chicago radio station was playing a thing where they're going to talk to the aliens. So what they did is they had this special hour, and they're going to talk to the aliens, and they have this show, and then they leave. I think it's a 2-minute gap, and the aliens are supposed to respond, and everybody in Chicago is listening to this radio station, and if they get anything, they're supposed to tape the radio if the message comes across, and nothing comes across except for about 4 people, and 2 of the people were twin sisters, and they got a audio during this 2 minutes, and this message comes through, and it's not voices or anything like that, but they get this message, and of course they're contacted by the U.S. Air Force, actually the CIA. So the Air Force guys come, and so this guy finds out, he's a researcher, and he actually believes UFOs don't exist. He believes it's psychological warfare, and he thinks it's all garbage, whatever, but he finds out that these 2 women had handed this film over to the U.S. Air Force. So, and even though and the Air Force is supposed to be involved, CIA is not involved. CIA said in '53 they were out, so this is after they're already out of the business. So he goes to the Air Force, and the Air Force, they send a letter to the CIA, and they say, well, it was analyzed by another agency, and suddenly this guy realizes the CIA is involved, and he starts going after the CIA. So the CIA doesn't know what to do, because they've dressed a guy up like an Air Force guy, and gotten this film, and they don't want to give the film back. So then they say, well, they destroyed the film to save space, which is, they've used this line 100 times, and they basically won't say who analyzed the film. And this guy's so determined to get the CIA that he's in New York City, so they dress up a guy in an Air Force uniform again, and they send him down to talk to this guy, pretending to be this guy who picked up the film, and they're doing this thing to try to cover this thing, and he still doesn't buy it, and he actually goes to the director of the CIA, and he starts directing letters to the CIA, and a congressman gets involved, and this congressman actually gets involved, and the CIA actually has to put out a statement. And they basically say Davidson's belief that this agency is involved in the flying saucer furor, which is true. And what they do is they add a false statement. They say the US CIA is involved in this flying saucer stuff and is using it as a psychological warfare, is totally unfounded, which is true. They weren't using it for psychological warfare, but they take the true statement, put a false statement on the end, and say it's all false. And of course, everybody just sort of goes away, and the CIA is so upset that there's actually a memo goes out from the CIA director that says, nobody talks to Davidson, nobody sends him letters, ignore him, because the more they talk, the more trouble they got in, because they were covering up this whole fact that they had this film, and the film has never been recovered. In '58, Kehoe, who ran NICAP, which was the biggest UFO organization in the United States, had 5,000 people. In '58, he'd already determined. CIA said they were out of it in '53. Air Force didn't get out until '69. And in '58, he went on a major CBS interview, which was big back then because there was only like the 3 stations, and basically said the CIA is in charge. It's not the Air Force. The CIA is doing the analysis. So already in '58, Kehoe had already said, these guys are working behind the scenes, investigating stuff. They say they're out of it, and they're not out of it. 1964, this is the guy that took over for Kehoe. Dick Hall, who just died a few years ago, was a major figure, was contacted, and the CIA, if you read this study, if you go CIA UFO, it'll pop up on a Google search. It'll show you this 1997 study. It's actually pretty interesting. And in this study, they say that the reason they contacted him was because in 1964, the White House had a high-level discussion on the possibilities of extraterrestrials, and that they needed some input, so they contacted him to ask him for a few of the best cases from NICAP. Now, the Nightcap's version of the story is no, he wasn't contacted until 1965. They were getting him a security clearance, and they wanted him to be the official UFO guy for the CIA, and he was actually had a private phone line from the CIA into his office, and he was handing over stuff to the CIA. And he wasn't working on their side. It was just they were helping him, and he was just trying to convince, as we all try to do. We're trying to get the government to believe us. Oh, please, and we'll give you the best cases. And that's what he was doing. He was just trying to impress the CIA to study the thing, and they were basically taking these cases and actually had approved him for a security clearance. So this thing broke, and this guy took a lot of heat. You know, you're working for the CIA, and I knew the guy. There was no such thing. This is an important one. In 1969, and this came up, this was discovered in the late 70s, Nightcap was the biggest group, and it was very, very powerful. It had the former head of intelligence, CIA director. It had generals and all sorts of high-ranking people on their board. They're very, very powerful. And what happened in 1970 was that basically the entire board ended up being CIA people. People said, oh, I'm interested, like Arthur Lundahl was on the board, this guy that ran the Weird Desk first. And so these guys all said we're interested in UFOs, and they had covers. They weren't saying they were CIA guys, and they had covers, and suddenly in the late 70s, everybody discovered that all these guys were CIA. And basically what they did is they had a meeting, and they decided Kehoe's got to go. And they voted him off. They just said, you're gone, and Kehoe was gone, and the whole organization folded. And it doesn't exist anymore. It was the biggest organization in the United States. This is probably the most important slide of the whole thing. And this is the point that I'm making. In 1969, the U.S. Air Force got out of the UFO program, the same as the UK is now getting out of the UFO program. And this is what you're going to read from the UK, the same thing. No UFOs reported, investigated, and evaluated by the U.S. Air Force has ever indicated a threat to national security. There is no evidence submitted or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technology or developments beyond present scientific knowledge. And there's no evidence that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. The Canadians say it, the British say it, everybody says it. That's the standard line. It's not ET, no national security, we're not interested. So in '69, they shut down. And the next slide is going to be where it makes the entire point, and I say is probably the most important story in ufology, happens in 1973. I know this guy. I wanted to do a book. If anybody wants to do a book, there's a book in this. This is an amazing story. It's one of the best stories in ufology. Air Force gets out of UFOs, 1969. It's a public relations nightmare. They even admitted this. Who wants to, what you want to do is you want to do it in the dark. You want to do it as a black budget program. You want to investigate behind the scenes. You don't want to, every time there's a sighting, and you got to go put some Air Force guy out there to make up some swamp gas thing and have people laughing at it. You don't want that. You don't want to do it in public. You want to do it in private. So in '69, they get out of the UFO program. They say, we're not involved. We're not interested. In 1973, and I've talked to Bob lots of times. I know him very well. He's an advertising executive for in Los Angeles for an advertising company. He does potato chip commercials, Bank of America, all this sort of stuff. His friend, whose name is Alan Sandler, has a production facility, says, we've got a job with the U.S. military. So they go to Norton Air Force Base, which is in California, and Norton Air Force Base has DAVA, the Defense Audio Visual Agency, which has all the military film from all the different, Army, Navy, Air Force, all this sort of stuff. All the film is held at Norton Air Force Base. They go, and Bob tells the story. And Bob said, my wife was into this, and the alien had the wife had an alien baby, and even when I'm at his house, he's going, Margaret, don't go down. Oh, Margaret, he just doesn't believe in UFOs. The only thing he believes is this story that happened to him. He's so skeptical. And his wife just drives him nuts, and he just tells her, Margaret, I don't want to hear it, Anyway, he gets this call, so they go to Norton Air Force Base. They get taken inside a clean room, which is a room where the CIA and people do films where it can't be monitored. They're inside a clean room at Norton Air Force Base, and the guy that comes up to him is Paul Shartle, and he's the security manager, and he says, we want you to do these documentaries to make the U.S. military look better. And we want you to do one on dolphins, and we want you to do one. They had a guy who could talk to a computer with his head at the DARPA, and they had dolphins who Bob figured could actually take a a bomb, strap a bomb on, and go and touch the nose against the ship and make the, blow up the ship, and all this kind of stuff. And what they wanted was to show that the U.S. military is working on all these different sort of things. And then they said, there's about 8 programs. And then they said, we've got this one other one we want you to do, but we want you to hide it under all these other programs of talking about the military. We want you to do a documentary on UFOs. And Bob went, what? UFOs? And Bob his wife has been telling his wife to shut up for years, and suddenly they're telling him to do a documentary on UFOs. And so the game begins. Now here it is, the U.S. Air Force is out of the program. Suddenly they call him into a clean room, and they say, we want you to do a documentary. Not only do we want you to do a documentary, what would you think if we told you that we actually had a landing of an alien at Haldeman Air Force Base, and we've got the film, and we'll give you the film for the documentary? And Bob, I guess his head's just spinning. What Bob really maybe didn't know at that time, was Alan Sandler, his buddy, had the connections. He had the CIA connections. So it was Sandler that got the thing, and Bob is just the guy who's going to do all the work. So the whole thing works, and they go through the whole thing, and Bob is working for Nixon. He's working for the Nixon re-election campaign because he's an advertising executive. He knows Haldeman, who was chief of staff for Nixon. He went to school with him and knew him, and he was in daily communication while this UFO production was on, with a guy who was the communications guy for Nixon. Talked to him almost every day while this thing was going on. The entire time that they had this production going on, they had a CIA guy on the productions. And the guy's name is Dick Betsky, we know. So here's the whole thing. The government's not involved, and yet they got a CIA guy sitting on the production thing. They're giving these people film, and they actually had the Haldeman Air Force Base film. They had it. So anyway, they have the film. This is Bill Coleman is the guy that gave them the film. And he was in the Pentagon. He was the spokesman for Blue Book, Colonel Bill Coleman. Oh, they're going to go through this story. Let me tell this story, and then I'll go back to Bob with the thing. One of the stories that they had been given, they'd been given the Haldeman Air Force Base film, which in the end gets pulled. It's the same thing as Disney. They pull the film at the last second. Say, it's the Vietnam War, it's a bad time, it's not time to release this, we're going to have to pull it back. Bob says there's a big couple in a little Datsun, and they're in Los Angeles, and they got to drive across the country with these film canisters in the back seat, and they're taking the film back to the Pentagon. One of the stories they're given, and this comes back to yesterday I was talking about Wilbur Smith in contact, and his main contact was this Mrs. Frances Swan, who was in Elliott, Maine. And Frances Swan, this is a story that they give to Bob, and this is a story nobody's known about the story. We've confirmed the story's true. So the point is, if you're out of the business, why would the CIA come and give this story that I'm going to tell you? Give this story to a producer in 1973 to tell a story. You don't have to tell the story. Why would you leak the story? It's a very embarrassing story, because what it basically involves is this woman, it happens at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, this very top secret place. This is the only photograph I've ever been able to get of the building. And this comes off Bob's documentary. The building's been torn down. I've looked everywhere. You cannot find a picture of this very secret building. This is the inside. This is Bob's friend. So what happens is, this woman, they pick her up in 1954. She's talking to the Canadians. The FBI is looking into this thing. Navy intelligence talks to her. They interview her in 1954. 1959, they send these guys back down. We don't know exactly why they sent it. They said it was for time in a plane, to get time in a plane. But they go back, and there's 2 guys, and Navy guys, and the one guy is this Lundahl, the guy that runs the Weir desk. It's his assistant. So they go down there, and they're talking to her about this and that, and she's able to answer all sorts of technical questions. I think she had grade 4 education. When she wrote me, I mean, you could barely understand what she was writing. So they're talking to her, and then she says, well, why don't I just show you how to do it? And the guy, well, okay. And he sat down in the chair, and she put her right hand on his shoulder, and he could talk to AFA. So he's channeling this AFA alien that Smith had written the book on, the whole anti-gravity thing, the operator. So now we've got another person involved in this AFA thing. So he's, of course, very fascinated. He goes racing back to the CIA because he knows Art Lundahl is fascinated in UFOs. And he goes into the National Photographic Interpretation Center, and he says, Art, man, she taught me how to do this. I can talk to this alien. And so Lundahl says, okay, sit down. So they sit this guy down. And what happened was, when the story was told, Bob Emenegger talked to Art Lundahl, and he said, Art Lundahl told him, and they have this memo which is on my website, and Art Lundahl tells him the story, and then Bob says, well, can you come on can I film you telling this story? And he says, no, Bob, you don't understand. I'm on duty. So we'll tell you the story, but we're not going to do it on the record. We're not going to give you anything that you can concretely grab onto and run with. So what they do is they get a friend who ran Blue Book, and he's the guy that tells the story on this documentary. And he tells the story, and his involvement was that when this happened, they immediately phoned him. He was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base running the Air Force UFO investigation. They call him in and say, you got to come see this, man. So he immediately emergency flies to Washington, and they put this guy under, they channel him again. He's sitting in a chair, and he channels the second time with Bob Friend. And the second time, they ask this guy to appear, and then the alien says, no, the time isn't right. So he said it was one of the most fascinating cases he'd ever seen. But the actual story before he came, that they told him to come down, you got to see this, is they're channeling this thing and they're asking questions. Who do you work for? How far is this? They're asking this guy scientific questions. He's answering all these questions. And then Art Lundahl, who's asking the questions, and this is all in this memo, says to the guy, he says, well, we need more proof. AFA, through this guy channeling, says, what do you want? We'd like you to show yourself. And he said, go to the window. So they all get up and they run to the window, and this is the story when Bob Friend is telling it on air. They're looking at, he's standing at the window where they looked out, and this flying saucer in the middle of the day flew right by the Capitol. And they all said they saw it. And Bob said to Lundahl, did you see it? And Bob says, yeah, I saw it. It was there. And they all admitted that this was real. So when this happened, they called in Friend, this emergency meeting, and you got to see this. And what happened, to show you how they hide this stuff, is they have the memo. So Bob has the memo, and the story that I got it from when I put the whole story on the website, I got an email from Jacques Vallée, and he said, okay, you got the story, here's the memo. And he sent me the memo, but it was in handwriting. So I'm trying to find out what's this. It's the old deal. You can't get they won't give you anything concrete that you can actually run with. The story they told me was when Friend came back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, he put the document on his desk, the CIA memo that describes, and on my website you can see it, it's 11 pages, has all the names of the CIA guys that were in the room, everything, and it's on his desk, and J. Allen Hynek, who was the top researcher, who was the science advisor to the Blue Book, happens to be walking through the office and sees this memo on the desk and went, ooh, that's pretty cool, and hand wrote the memo. So he hand writes this memo out, so we've just got a handwritten copy, and that's what they do. It's like the trap door. It's like the memo's no good because I can't prove to you it's a real memo. It's just a handwritten copy of the memo. Nobody knows where the memo is. So that's what they do. So this is one of the stories that Bob has told. This is Francis Swan. So they have the Holloman film. Now this is the critical part, and this is, again, why would you release film to a producer when you say you're out of the business? Why would you have this film? And Bob, they claimed, yeah, we had the film. So you have the Holloman film. It's taken to Holloman Air Force Base, and Bob would tell stories about, they wanted to go down to Holloman. They wanted to check the story. So they get the production team, and they phone up Holloman Air Force Base, and they say, we want to come down there and do some filming, because the UFO landed, and they came out, and these high-ranking officials met them, and then they went down onto Mars Avenue, and they put this craft inside a building, and where the aliens went. So he wanted to go and see all these buildings. And the guy at Holloman Air Force Base said, you want to do what? This is a top secret base. You ain't coming on no base. So they have a handler at the Pentagon. So they go to this handler, which his name escapes him. We have his name. And he says, well, they're not letting us on the base. He said, I'll give it 10 minutes. Phone him back in 10 minutes. Phone him back in 10 minutes. He says, yeah, come on down. And Bob said it was like doing this documentary, they had every single Blue Book head. Everybody talked to them. It was like, you're going to talk to this guy, and they were down in the underground bunker talking to Weinbrenner, and Weinbrenner's talking to them about stories about, this colonel guy with the dead bodies and stuff, and they're just sort of floored that everybody's talking to them, and that's what Bob says. There's no cover-up. They didn't have cover-up for anything with me. And basically, he could walk on the base, and he said they gave him a guide, drive him around, and anywhere you want to go on the base, there's a top-secret base. He's driving around, and they're opening this thing where they supposedly stuck the ship, but they get the film. And of course, at the last minute, they pull the film down. But here's the part that where sort of Bob and I sort of divided, where he made some sort of deal. They pull the film, but then in the film, if you look at it, and this is called the documentary, you got to Google search it. It's called UFOs It Has Begun. That's the second version. They did a version in 1975 called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. 79, they changed the name and they ran it again, and they had Sterling narrate. So it's called UFOs It Has Begun. It is absolutely approved by the White House because there was a letter. Linda Howe told me she saw the letter. It was signed by Nixon. He said, "Thank you for your cooperation on the project we worked on." And it was to Bob Emenegger. And Bob, that's one of the things he won't talk about, is this letter. He keeps he won't really, and I was there, and Linda was confronting him at a table, like, "Why don't you just clear it up? I saw the letter. You just come clean." And this is the other part, the 8 seconds of the film. I asked Bob about this. So they pull the film back, but if you look at the documentary, there's 8 seconds of the film in the documentary. Here's the 8 seconds. Maybe not. Oh, that's too bad. Okay, I'll describe to you what it was. What you see is the hills at Holloman Air Force Base, and you see this little tiny light coming over the hills, and it's moving in, and they have like voices in the background of radar, and you identify yourself, and they just make up all this stuff. But this light is coming in. So I asked Bob. I said, "Well, I thought you pulled the film back. Why did they give you 8 seconds?" And he said, "Well, and then I talked to him again. And finally he said, "Well, it didn't show the UFO. It didn't show the aliens. And it was just background." And I didn't catch on until this Brandon thing and explained exactly what was going on. When Chase Brandon tells a story about the Roswell box, and on my website you'll see I talk about the Roswell box. This is total nonsense. There is no such thing as a Roswell box. I've worked in lots of archives. You're not going to have all the material. It's compartmentalized, so you're not going to have the photographs with the documents, with everything. And it's all going to be separated. It's going to be in the audiovisual department. You're not going to have it all in one box. So the box is total nonsense. And when Chase Brandon is talking about it, he basically says, "I can talk about the box, but I don't care what you do. I'm not talking about what's in the box." And that's because the box ain't classified. There was no box. He learned it someplace else, so he makes up the story of the box, so he can talk about the box all he wants, because it never existed. It's not classified. It's not breaking security. But what's inside, if he describes the alien, and I'm going to describe this in a minute, if he describes what the alien looked like, I saw a picture of an alien like this, that's classified material. What the alien looked like, what the photographs were, what the documents, that's classified material. So he won't talk about what's in the box, he will talk about the box. The same thing happens here. You see the object coming, it's just a light before it lands. It's just a light. It doesn't show the shape of the craft, which is classified. It doesn't show the aliens, which is classified. All it is a light, so you're given the piece of the story, you're given the actual Holloman Air Force Base film, and you don't have anything. It's keeping it away from the classified material. It's like the Roswell box coming over the hill, coming down to land. Now here's the other part. This happened... Oh, don't tell me we're frozen again. Hang on, we're frozen. Oh, this is... Okay. I got a call, I don't know if you people know Michael Luckman. He wrote the book on UFOs and famous movie stars and stuff like this, and Mick Jagger, and he interviewed all these people, and Lennon, and all these famous people who had UFOs. So he put out this book. He's a sort of a production reporter. He does all sorts of stuff in New York. He calls me and he says, I want you to talk to Emenegger for me, because of course I know Emenegger better than anybody. And he says, they've hoaxed this thing. They've hoaxed the alien. This thing comes from a museum. I'm pretty sure, I was trying to find it, but it comes from a museum here in England. And here it is. He says, the film, this is because they had no film, they had to use this 8 seconds, and they had to do everything by storyboard. So they had a storyboard guy that worked for Bob Emenegger, and he would draw all the different parts, and they would sort of describe if this had happened, this is what would have happened. They're not even saying there was a film. They're just saying, if this had happened, if a UFO had landed here, this is what would have happened. And they describe it, and this is the way they show the alien. And it was always bizarre. Like, what kind of alien is this? So he comes to me and he says, this alien, they took it. It's a Sumerian image, and here it is from a British museum. And he says to me, I need you to get Emenegger to explain what the hell's going on. And I'm going, I don't know what's going on. I go, it sure does. Look, it's got the same ear, it's got the same hair, the braids, and there's even a picture with a rod. There's actually a rod there. And I'm going like, this looks pretty bad. So I asked Bob, and Bob really, here's the difference between the two. Here's the drawing that they did, and here's the one from the British Museum. So they're confronting me. You go to Bob and you find out why this is happening. I really couldn't explain it. And basically what it comes down to, when I figured it out, is Alan Sandler, what had happened is that you had Shardle, who was the security manager who provided them the film. Bob wasn't involved in drawing the alien. He had his storyboard guy do like a police sketch. So Shardle sat down, and Shardle told him, Shardle was the only guy that saw the film, and he's the government guy. So he describes to the storyboard guy, and he draws this alien because it's classified. You can't know what the alien, so he figures, oh, let's just make up an alien. And Bob had nothing to do with it. Sandler had nothing to do with it. The storyboard guy had nothing to do with it. He was just describing what somebody was describing. So they described this bizarre-looking alien that came out of the ship. That's not what the alien looked like, but they're protecting the classified material. Same as the Roswell box. You can talk about the fact there was a landing. Nobody can prove it one way or the other, but you can't talk about what the ship looked like, and you can't talk about the aliens. You change those parts of the story, and you tell the story. It's like Chase Brandon says, sometimes it's so amazing that you've got to put fiction around it, and that's what they're doing. So that's what happened with the Holloman Air Force Base story, and I'm actually on the air next Friday with Michael Luckman. He has a radio show, and I'm going to explain to him what happened. He's still mad. He's like, this is a big hoax, and I'm saying, I think I got an answer now. This is an interesting one. Len Stringfield, I knew him very well. He got a lot of contacts. His material has just been released. MUFON has their big conference in the United States right now, and they made the announcement yesterday that his files that everybody was after, 60 volumes, has just been released. He died in the mid-90s or whatever. His expertise was crashes. He's the guy that basically started the whole idea about alien autopsies, bodies, crashes, and the thing that always amazed me is I've been in this for 37 years. Nobody has ever come up to me and offered me a document. Nobody has ever come up to me and offered me to say, I worked on an alien autopsy and here's what happened and I want to tell you about it. Len Stringfield had 200 to 300 different witnesses, people who were coming to him and telling him this stuff, which is pretty obvious that he's being fed this stuff. He's being led along and being helped. Otherwise, why wouldn't they tell everybody else? Why has he got 300 sources and I got none? I was always suspicious of this fact, but he was a nice guy, and I would correspond with him, and we'd talk about various things. I remember I went to Dayton, Ohio in 1979, the first conference I ever went to, and I wanted to talk to him because he was interested in Wilbur Smith, and I went there, and I couldn't talk to him, and they said, you can't till later, and when I finally caught up, they moved him to a different hole. He had death threats, and this was before Roswell book came out. This is when the first lecture ever done on alien autopsies came out. This is 1978, 79. And his stuff has just been made. But here again, it's very obvious that he's being fed material. And some of it may be true, some of it may be false. But they want him to present a certain image of alien autopsies. How would you get 300 different sources? Why are they coming to him? And why are they bumping him off? I mean, if he's got this classified material, why aren't they bumping him off? They're actually leading us down a path. 1977 disclosure. This is the whole story about this happened in the U.S. News and World Report. I remember this. It was a big story in Washington. In the U.S. News and World Report, which is sort of like the big magazine in New York, Washington, there was a statement there that said, before the end of the year is out, the government, perhaps the president, is expected to make what are described as unsettling disclosures about UFOs, unidentified flying objects such as revelations based on information from the CIA, which would reverse official policy that in the past has downgraded UFO incidents. So the U.S. Air Force is out of it, and suddenly this major, like everybody reads it in Washington. Suddenly on their whisper page, they've got this thing that the CIA is going to provide material and disclosures coming. And it was like even the CIA director apparently had said to his official, he said, what, are we in UFOs? I mean, when he read this, it was like, and the panic had sort of broken out. And one of the people that had got a hold of this was a guy by the name of Todd Zeckel. He was a bit hard to deal with. I had dealt with him a bit. But he went to Arthur Lundahl, this guy that ran the UFO Weird Desk, and he said to them, he said, this thing's in the paper. He said, well, what's the deal? Is there a disclosure coming? And Lundahl said, well, hang on, I'm going to have to talk to the boys. And this is, according to Zeckel, these are the boys that he talked about. That there was Helms and Gates. that these two former CIA directors, that these were the guys that Lundahl knew that if there was disclosure, these two guys would know, because they are the guys that are behind disclosure. And I'm going to show you how the CIA directors are getting involved in this, trying to drop this stuff. So Lundahl said, hang on, I'll check. And he goes to the two guys that if there was disclosure coming, these are the two guys that are behind it, former CIA directors. 77 disclosure here is another one. This is Helms, and Kit Green deals with Helms. Helms contacts Kit Green, and Kit Green is the second guy. He takes after Lundahl, and he comes to him and basically tells him what is known in the United States as the core story. And the core story, I guess I should explain it to you. The core story is there's so much stuff going on in the UFO community. There's, good stuff, bad stuff, whatever. And the core story was Jacques Vallée, who I've quoted before. It was Hal Puthoff, who's the top guy on UFO propulsion. He runs the Austin Institute for Advanced Studies. And Kit Green all sit down in 1987, and they try to determine, what do we know for sure about UFOs? There's all this garbage, what do we know for sure? And that was called the core story. And the core story is that the U.S. government got a hold of a craft. Somehow they got a hold of it, whether it was a crash, whatever it was, but somehow they've got a control of a craft. They're not having much success with it, and that there was a live alien. So this is sort of the core story. And Helms comes to Kit Green, and Kit Green indirectly talks about this and talks to him and says, we want to tell you this story. And he basically confirms to Kit Green the fact that the core story is true, that there's crafts and there's a live alien. So this is another disclosure that takes place. That, I mean, if you're not in it, why are you sending a former CIA director? He's out of the office now, but a former CIA director, why would you go and contact some guy and tell him that it's for real, if there's nothing going on? 1978, 79, Bill Coleman, the guy who provided the Holloman Air Force Base film to Bob Emenegger, suddenly has a TV show, and he does all the UFO incidents from Blue Book, and they sort of solve all the cases, but they up it runs for 2 years, every week, for 2 years, and they do UFO cases, and this case from Blue Book, and this is what happened, and they solved it, and whatever. So he's out there upping UFOs, and he's a guy who always claims to be skeptical, except that he said he had his own UFO sighting. 1979, this is Kit Green is now in charge of the Weird Desk at the CIA. And Bruce Maccabee is the guy that's on the other side. Bruce Maccabee gets called in to lecture at the CIA. So the way you got to cover this is he's not lecturing to the CIA. I mean, this is not official. CIA is not involved in UFOs. He's coming in at lunchtime to talk. And the first time he went in, he talked about this famous case in Australia where the plane disappears. That was the one he did in 1979. And Maccabee will say, well, no, I was just helping out. I was just making a speech at the CIA. And then he makes a speech about MJ-12, which is the famous document during the 1980s that was leaked. And that one, apparently, was standing room only. The room at the CIA, you couldn't get in it. Everybody wanted to hear this lecture about the CIA. And one of the CIA guys said, well, you've now created a bunch of agents inside the CIA. They're all going to be trying to check each other's material to see who's got the MJ-12 stuff. So Maccabee was called in a number of times, over 15 years. And he's very good friends with Ronald Pandolfi. And call him in, and he believes he's just sort of helping out, and they give him something. He goes and lectures and tries to educate them. But if you're not involved with the CIA, if you're not involved in UFOs, why are you bringing in people to make UFO speeches at the CIA headquarters? Again, Ronald Pandolfi, this is the guy that's running it right now, he brings them in 1980 for another lecture. Then we go to the story about the Falcon. This is an important story. This is a story I was working on when Robbie Graham came after me. Over the Brandon story, and that is a story that in 1980, what happened was the Roswell story you all know, but if you haven't been in UFOs before 1980, you don't realize this, that the Roswell story only started in 1980, that before 1980, nobody knew about Roswell. Nobody had ever heard the name. The reason it became famous was because in 1980, Bill Moore and Berlitz, who was had an intelligence background, wrote a book on the Roswell story. Stanton Friedman provided a lot of the material, but it was Berlitz and Moore put out the book. It sold 1 million copies. Suddenly Roswell was everywhere. It was called the Roswell Incident in 1980. And Bill talks about, he's doing a publicity tour for the book. And it has all, like, it's not just, it's the stories of people who were there and Marcel and all these stories that people now talk about. So he's on the publicity tour, and he said, like, 7 days into the publicity tour all across the United States, and he gets a phone call from a guy, and the guy, this is the Falcon. And the Falcon says, he doesn't call himself the Falcon, he's just a guy. He says, I'm an intelligence officer, and you're the only guy that knows what you're talking about, which is the hook, it's the bait. Because Moore thought he was the greatest researcher in the world, and he was a pretty sharp guy. But he bought the bait. Yeah, I'm the only guy who knows what I'm talking about. And he didn't fall for it the first time. He said, okay, well, I'll call you back or whatever. And he keeps going, and a couple days later, he gets a phone call at another radio station, and he's just leaving the station and says, got a call, this guy wants to talk to you. And he goes, and the guy says, you're the only guy who knows what you're talking about. And Moore goes, well, this is kind of interesting. So this guy comes, and he meets this guy, and Bill Moore gives him a name, the Falcon. You'll hear about this Avery thing. And Bill gives all these secret sources that he has, names, bird names. And they don't know their bird names, but when he's talking to his associate, he can use the Falcon, and nobody knows who he's talking about. So he gives this guy the name the Falcon, and it's from the Falcon and the Snowman. He's from the CIA. And I didn't realize this until a month and a half ago. I've been trying for 30 years to figure out who the Falcon was, and it's finally been released. And I think we have it on the next slide. No. This guy played the Falcon. No. Let's go back up. Anyway, so he gets this contact, and what the guy says to him is very important. He says, I represent a bunch of high-ranking people in the U.S. government, and we want to get this policy changed on UFOs, and we need to get some of this material that we have out to the people. And we want to do it without breaking the law. And that's the key. It's the Chase Brandon Roswell box story. It's the Holloman Air Force Base story. It's the same thing. We want to do it without breaking the law. Whether you're the president, a top CIA guy, whoever you are, you cannot release classified material. So the way you get the story out is you put it into fiction. You change the details and you put it out. And that's what he was warned. He said, some of the stuff you're going to be given is information, some of it's going to be disinformation, and they started downloading piles of material to him. The MJ-12 document, the MJ-12, the Aquarius, all this material. And he said he had so much material coming in as to how the cover-up worked that he actually picked up an associate, which I'll get to in a little while. But let's go to the next slide here. Richard Doty was a guy that, in order to protect the Falcon, who this guy was, they had this Richard Doty guy, who lots of people think is the big disinformation guy, who actually told Linda Howe, I'm the Falcon. And when he did a UFO Cover-Up Live special in 1988, which is another documentary I think everybody should see, it was called UFO Cover-Up Live, he played in this backlit scene that I showed in the slide before, he plays the Falcon. And he tells the producer, he's the Falcon, and they know who he is. So he plays the Falcon, and for 30 years, and people still today are saying, no, it's Richard Doty's the Falcon, and it's like, this is cover. It's diversion. They're diverting you away, and they're mixing up the scene. So this guy played the Falcon, and he provided some material. And what a lot of people say is it's disinformation, and this guy's the disinformation guy. He's the guy that put out the Serpo stuff. He's behind everything. And I said, well, I've had one dealing with him. He's not that smart. I don't think he could do all this sort of stuff. But what I discovered is that a lot of people, this is on my website, I got an interview with Doty. And this only happened a couple months ago. I put the interview up on Doty, and I've got it, and I haven't even changed it yet. The way I scanned it and put it on this program on my thing, you can't really read it. It's too small to read. So one of the people, very high-ranking person, who gives me some material, says to me, you got that Doty interview. Can you fix it? Can you put it so we can read it? And where did you get the Doty interview from? And Doty's this disinformation guy, but I know that there's all these high-ranking people are watching Doty. And Helms apparently told Kit Green, believe everything that Doty says on UFOs. And in the UFO community, everything's Doty's a total idiot. He's a hoaxer. He's just causing trouble. And then yet the former director of CIA tells Kit Green, believe everything he says. So Doty's running around, and I got this thing on my thing, and I still won't change it. And the guy emails me back, and he said, you haven't changed it yet. Can you give me a copy of this thing? And it give me the indication that he's not a disinformation guy. If this guy that's contacting me wants to see this interview, they're interested in Richard Doty. They're not trying to get fooled. They all believe that this guy's got stuff. And what Kit Green says, he says the way it works is like this. And it's in an interview. There's a British, The Mirage Man, the book The Mirage Man. The British guy comes over to the United States. He interviews Kit Green. And he actually, if you read the book, when he's interviewing Kit Green, who briefed the presidents on UFOs. He was one of the briefers. Lundahl was one of the briefers of the president. Kit Green. So he's interviewing Kit Green, and he said he actually started to sort of sweat when Kit Green started talking, because his idea was all disinformation. It's all just garbage, Richard Doty. Everybody's throwing off people, and it's a big game to catch Russian spies and stuff like this. And then Kit Green starts to talk about, yeah, this is for real. And he in the book, he talks about, wow, you know, he started to sweat. Like, I can't believe this former top CIA guy is suddenly talking this is for real. And Kit Green says, well, how are you going to do it? If you want to get the information out to the people, how are you going to do it? You've got to figure out a way to do it. So what you do is you tell the people, oh, the aliens are going to eat you and this and that. And you put all these stories out. And people are just inundated with all these stories. And then when it breaks, the story is, there's ETs, they're visiting. That's it. And everybody goes, that's it? No aliens eating people? No, nothing. And suddenly everybody goes, well, what's wrong with that? And that's what Kit Green says they're trying to do, is they're trying to inundate people with all these stories so that when the real story comes out, it's actually lower than what they're putting out, and everybody's going to be calm, and you're not going to get this sort of backlash. And this is a guy who ran the Weird Desk and briefed the presidents on UFOs, and says it in this book. He's quoted in the book as talking about this. There's the interview. This is the actual Falcon, who turned out, I thought he was Defense Intelligence Agency. He turned out to be a CIA. And that's when the bell sort of came to me. And I have to go back and change all my website. But what happened was, he was CIA. I always believed it was DIA. Once I realized he was CIA, I suddenly realized what had happened. Bill Moore, who put out the Roswell book, put it out with Berlitz. Berlitz had an intelligence background. During the 1980s, when I was researching, I knew Bill Moore, and Bill Moore had helped me with a couple of cases. Bill Moore was a very smart guy, but he had a big ego. And one of the people, he did an interview. There was a guy who was helping me in California, knew Bill Moore, who did an interview with a woman by the name of Mrs. Wang. And her husband had supposedly back engineered, working on he was in charge of the back engineering of flying saucers at Kirkland Air Force Base. He had died in 1960, and so this Bill Steinman is interviewing the wife. And the wife says, well, you know, if you really want to know, you should talk to the guy who was my husband's boss, Henry Kissinger. And so this is where the Henry Kissinger story comes, that Henry Kissinger is one of the people who's running the show. So anyway, Bill Steinman does this interview, and Bill Moore phones him up the next day and says to him, what are you talking to Mrs. Wang for? Leave Mrs. Wang alone. And he says, how'd you know I talked to Mrs. Wang? He said, I know. And he told him what had happened to the phone call. You had it taped. How do you know I talked to Mrs. Wang? And Bill kept going around, and Bill said, no, I want to know. I want to know, how did you know I talked to Mrs. Wang? And he said, well, come over to my house tomorrow and I'll tell you what happened, or how I did it. So Steinman goes over, and I held this secret for 25 years until 2 months ago. Steinman goes over and says to Bill, okay, so how'd you know? He said, well, I'll tell you what. When I was going to university, I was recruited by the CIA. And they were recruiting on campuses, and it was true. In the 60s, they were recruiting people on U.S. campuses. I was recruited by the CIA. I did a little bit of legwork for them. I wrote a couple of reports. And then I went off and became a school teacher. And when I got into UFOs, I reestablished all my CIA contacts. So here it is. Bill Moore is CIA. And I knew this, and I never made it public. When Bill Moore got all this material, when he was getting so much material from this Falcon guy in 1981, he said he had to bring in Jamie Chandray. The big question in the UFO community was, why didn't he pick Stanton Friedman? Stanton Friedman helped him write the Roswell book. Stanton Friedman was the best researcher there was. Why would he turn against Stanton Friedman when he was partners with Stanton Friedman and pick up a film producer in Los Angeles who had never been involved in UFOs? And when the MJ-12 document came, it went to Jamie Chandray's house. And everybody's going like, why did it go to Jamie Chandray? Why didn't it go to Moore's house? Moore, later after he leaves the field, actually says, well, Jamie Chandray was intelligence, worked for the CIA. So here it is, you have the Falcon contacting Moore, Moore's CIA, Berlitz is CIA, Chandray is CIA, and that's what it comes down to. And I'll tell you at the end, I'll tell you the story. I've never been contacted by anybody with documents. I've got secret documents, I work for the government, this sort of stuff, because you've got to be an intelligence guy. They trusted Bill Moore, so they went to Bill Moore. They could keep him quiet. He had worked for them. They knew Chandray was brought in because he was intelligence, and that's how they're leaking the material. And Bill Moore got the vast majority of the stories you hear now about Area 51 started with Bill Moore. The MJ-12 document started with Bill Moore. All the real heavy stuff came through Bill Moore through the Falcon. And this guy was a secret, he was a Soviet guy. And when it was released, the guy that released it said, well, no, this was a disinformation thing to catch Russian spies. And they brought this guy in from retirement. So I said to him, I said, well, if they brought him in from retirement, then he wasn't the top guy. Somebody else was running the show. It's not this Rositsky guy. It's somebody else. They bring him in from retirement to somebody else. And what I think it is, it's these former CIA directors who are running it. They bring in this guy just to run the operation. So he contacts Moore. They start feeding all this kind of stuff. And then what happens is Moore gets burned. He makes a speech in 1989 at the MUFON conference, and he says, oh, I was helping out. I was working this stuff and all this sort of stuff. And everybody went, you're a what? And people were throwing stuff at him on the stage. And it was it. His career was over, because he was seen as a guy who worked for the government, that he turned on us and he'd gone and worked for the government. And Moore always said he was working with the government, and I believe that was true. He was working with the government. He never took any money for it. He just believed that in order to figure out how this cover-up works, I'm a smart guy, I can figure it out, and they offered him a position on the inside to watch on the inside. And so he took the chance, he stepped over the line, and he worked with them to find out how does this thing work. But when he made it public, he was gone. His career was over. He just basically left. He couldn't lecture anymore. Nobody would believe anything he said. Everybody said he was just a disinformation guy, and yet he was a good guy. So here's 1980. Here's this thing where they tell him that it's going to be information, good information, bad information. We're not going to break the law, which is important. Here's the Ronald Reagan thing. I'm going to sort of skip over this. They came out of the Serpo material. William Casey. Part of the Serpo material is supposedly a briefing of that's given to Reagan at the Camp David by the CIA director William Casey. And I was given a hard time. I lectured at Phoenix at the UFO Congress, and a guy came, one of these guys who sort of knows people, he came and he said, well, why didn't you put the Reagan thing in there? And I said, well, because there's disinformation in it. And he said, well, it's only 5% disinformation, 10%. I said, well, what's the 5-10%? Unless I know what I'm talking about, I mean, it's a bunch of junk as far as I'm concerned. There's truth in it, and that's what Kit Green is saying. The truth is in there, but they're elaborating, they're making it all different so that, as Chase Brandon says, when you read my book, read between the lines and you'll read something out of it. That he's telling you the story, but you can't figure out what's real and what's not real. You just sort of surmise, and they're generally getting the story across. That's at Camp David. Here's Bill Moore and Jamie Chandere, both CIA people, and we didn't find out till later. Richard Doty, who tells Linda Howe to throw everybody off. I'm the Falcon, and for 30 years everybody chased Richard Doty, and the Falcon was doing whatever he wanted because he was running cover for the Falcon. Bob Emenegger, 1983. Bob he does the program in the 1970s, and he still won't admit this Nixon letter, but one of the confirming things is in 1983, when all this stuff with Bill Moore was going on, when he was getting material, he was contacted, taken back to Norton Air Force Base. And they said, we want you and Jacques Vallée, and we want J. Allen Hynek. And there was a general who was the first he was the first agent for Ronald Reagan in Hollywood. He was a general, and he was assistant at DAVA at the time. And they brought him in, and they said, we want you to, the government liked your first documentary. They'd like you to do another documentary. And Bob's first question was, is this Ronald Reagan? Is Ronald Reagan asking for this? Which confirms to me that he was working for Nixon the first time. Is Ronald Reagan working for this? And he said they never got an answer. They wouldn't answer it. And then they said, the general says to Chartle, who saw the film, who drew the alien, who told the guy how to draw the alien. Chartle is still security manager. And the general says to Chartle, Hynek's here. I want you to take all the UFO film, get it out of the vault, and give it to Hynek. And he says, sorry, General, I can't do that. I need a requisition. You can't just do it that way. And he said, God damn, I'll have your ass. You get that film out and you give it to Hynek. And he said, no, General, I can't do it. I need a requisition. You can't go through that process. And it all fell apart. And Hynek and Vallée figured it was going to be like the first documentary. They're going to pull the film, and they figured their career was on the line and they weren't getting involved, so they pulled out and the second documentary fell apart. But here again, here's the U.S. Air Force, CIA say, we're not involved. Why would you bring somebody over to a Norton Air Force Base and give them another offer? And the first one, they had signed a contract. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. They signed a contract. They were paid. It was like, he said, like any other production film they'd ever done. And an interesting story. It's not really related to disclosure, but an interesting thing you probably don't know. This whole story of Holman. The alien lands. They know it's coming. They're filming it. 1975. Spielberg's sister, Annie Spielberg, is working with Bob, and they're doing UFO, like science fiction films and stuff, and Spielberg is working. So then suddenly they say, well, Steven Spielberg wants a copy of the documentary of the Holloman landing and all this stuff. So they give the 1975, they give Spielberg the documentary. 1977, Spielberg comes out with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Alien coming down, the film camera's going, everybody's waiting for the thing, you have the exchange, the aliens come out of the ship. It's exactly the same thing. And I said to Bob, I said, in fact, that's how it came up. I said, well, the Holloman story sounds exactly like the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And that's when he said, oh, I didn't tell you? And I said, tell me what? Oh, we gave Spielberg a copy of the film. I said, we gave Spielberg a copy? And he said, yeah, in fact, his mother came up after it, and she said, I saw your version of the landing, and I saw Steven's version of the landing, and I like Steven's version better. So that's where Close Encounters come. Emenegger, as I said, Emenegger and Hynek pulled out of this 1983 thing. UFO Cover-Up Live, this, I recommend you watch this. This is where the Falcon appears. And they released a bunch of classified material on this documentary. J. Allen Hynek, I'll tell you a story about J. This is told by Bill Moore, which shows you how infiltrated the UFO community is. He claims that J. Allen Hynek, they set up this Benowitz. I don't know if you know this Benowitz story. One of the things was, there was a guy outside of Kirkland Air Force Base. He was looking inside the base, and the Air Force had to get this guy. He was seeing UFOs flying over the missile storage area. So they had to set this guy up, and they basically drove this guy nuts. J. Allen Hynek was part of that. He worked on behalf of the U.S. Air Force, Office of Special Investigations. He provided this guy a computer, which was supposedly a computer to keep track of the UFOs flying around, and it was actually a computer that was tracking what this guy was doing. So J. Allen Hynek, here he's supposedly on our side, and Moore says, no, he's working on the other side the same as I was. And he was actually providing material to this guy to throw him off. So it's sort of the infiltration, and Hynek would be the same thing. He was being paid for them. He was getting material from them. You give me this, I give you that. It's like you have a secret source. You don't release his name. You tell him stuff, and he tells you stuff, and you're not really working for the guy. You're just exchanging stuff. And I think that's what was going on here, too. The MJ-12 document, I probably won't get into this because I don't, except to say, I think I told that story yesterday, that it was actually released in the United Kingdom at the same time. That was part of the deal. Tim Good had it in his book. At the time, it was the best-selling UFO book in the world, and it was put out exactly the same time as they did in the United States. With one day, they were sort of fighting with this one day who was going to make the announcement first. Became a big story, is still a big story, and it's basically a story that says that there's a control group called MJ-12, and there's a lot of truth to this. It's a document, and what they've done with the document is they've taken the real story and they've put out a document that looks legitimate, that's good enough to fool Moore, because Moore was a smart guy, and Stanton Friedman fell for it. Everybody had to fall for this document, so they put out the document, and all you have to do is change 2 words in the document. Then you say, it's a phony document. It's not classified. You can release phony documents. All you've got to do is change a couple of words, and that's what they do. They take the real document, change a couple of words, put it out, and they're not breaking the law. And that's what they said to Moore. We'll do it, but we're not going to break the law. So the MJ-12 document is phony. Tim Good released it here at the same time. Still wouldn't. When the Falcon thing came out, I contacted Tim Good, and he didn't say. I thought maybe he'd say, oh, that was the guy who gave me the document, but he didn't. One of the things that people don't know is that Tim Good released the MJ-12 document in Britain, but he wasn't the first. Jenny Randalls was offered the MJ-12 document before. She turned it down, she sort of messed up. She tried to investigate the guy she was talking to, and it all sort of fell apart. They sort of dumped her and went to Tim Good. But you can see that people are being contacted with material. This is 2 in Great Britain, and it had something to do with it had to be done in Great Britain at the same time as the United States, this big document release. And somebody explained it to me one time. It didn't make any sense. 1988, UFO Cover-Up Live. I think I mentioned this yesterday, the flow chart. I talked about the parapsychology, the consciousness thing. It's part of UFOs, and in 1988 it was still classified, and this was the chart that was shown in this 1988 documentary. It shows this, which is classified, and it also shows Area 51. Area 51 did not become public till 1989. This was a year before Area 51, before Bob Lazar went public. It was already in this documentary. Bill Moore knew about it, the importance of Area 51. So you get material. They're releasing material in there, and some of this actually has been changed to me, and people have told me this agency is wrong. It should be this agency. So it's partly true, partly false, but it gives you the idea that the president is in charge, the MJ-12 is the control group, and then it gives you little bits of classified material that will be released later on. And when I go back, when somebody said the classified material was there, I went, it was on the flow chart, and I go back, yeah, it was. I didn't know it until just recently. Bill Moore, this is a story. Anyway, they had one with me. Kit Green actually ran a thing. He was called the Blue Jay, and Bill Moore actually helped me out. So I knew Bill Moore fairly well. He helped me out. Kit Green actually went and talked to one of our main witnesses to try to get to the bottom of what this guy knew. Gates, I think this is Gates, was apparently behind this documentary. He was one of the guys who was pushing it. The story of Bob Lazar, if you go on my website, it was one of the stories that I wrote. I wrote the true story of Area 51. It was out about 6 months ago, and it's a completely different story than you've heard. And it got about 150,000 hits in about 3 weeks or whatever. And what I say happened to Bob Lazar, people will say, Bob Lazar was on there, and I think most people know the Area 51 story. Bob Lazar went on there, and then it turned out he didn't have the degrees. It's all a bunch of garbage. That's why I played this clip at the beginning of my lecture yesterday, where George Knapp, who did the investigation, says, well, maybe Lazar had some problems with his reputation, but here's a guy that I tracked down, and he told me the same story, and it's for real. And I've got 25 other witnesses who are telling me the story for real. And the way I knew that this was exactly the same, put it out, pull it back, this is one of the old put it out, trap door, falls apart. They went to Bob Lazar, and what everybody missed, I played all the interviews of Bob Lazar and the whole Area 51 for years back. I looked at them all, and John Lear told the story. John Lear was behind this. John Lear was a famous pilot. His father developed Lear Jet, and he was the one that told Lazar to go up and work at the base, that they had UFOs, go work up at the base. When he went to the interview, technical interviews, he was with EG&G, who hires him to send him up to the base. The first interview is a technical interview. The first question in the second interview is, do you know John Lear, and what do you think about him? John Lear's the UFO guy. He was running around doing UFO lectures. He was famous because his father was famous. He was known all over the place. So in the second interview, they already knew that Bob Lazar wanted to work up at the base, and he didn't say the UFO thing. He just wanted to work up at the base, that he knew John Lear. So they put him up there, and they put him in the UFO area. They want John Lear, let's put him up there, because we know his background is bad. And as soon as he goes out, it's all going to fall apart. People are going to realize he doesn't have 2 master's degrees. Everybody's going to say it's a hoax. Lear's going to look like a total idiot. We're going to get the story out. The problem with the Area 51 story, they put him up there. He came out. The story fell apart. But everybody started to go up on the base. Everybody started to go and look down at the base, and they had to buy up 50,000 acres to stop people from going up in the base. They didn't realize the story was going to go viral. And now we've got the story that Knapp says the story's true. Whether Lazar is a bad witness or not, basically Lazar saw what he saw, and they took him up there and let him see it, and only let him work there he only worked a couple days. He goes, and they knew he was going to tell John Lear about it, because John Lear was telling him to go work there. The phone was tapped. They knew all this. They knew it was all going to fall apart, and everybody was going to say Area 51 is a hoax. Lazar made it up, and we're going to get the Area 51 story. Everybody's going to know that we got UFOs and we got a live alien, and nobody's going to believe it because it's going to be seen as a hoax. So that was the Lazar story. That's how they did that one. 89 disclosure. I don't know if I'll do this one. This is the Governor General gets abducted. Let me skip that one. UFO cover-up live. Skip that. UFO working group. This is one that I don't know if people know John Lear. This is a story that had been leaked by the National Security Agency. An officer in the National Security Agency had gone to the chief investigative reporter for the New York Times. They're not involved in UFOs, but he goes in and he says, guess what? There's a group inside the government who's working on UFOs, and he writes this book. And the book is called Out There. It's top investigative reporter for the New York Times. He writes the book, and it comes out, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It's sort of like, well, we don't know who it is and whether it's true or whatever. I had this guy who had been working for the National Institute. He'd been fired, anyway. And he was telling me what was going on. He provided me the notes. Some guy had been there at this meeting, and I got the notes. So I put out the notes because it was classified. The first page, all I did was take this little banner part to show that it was top secret restricted, and it took place at the McLean Secure Facility in McLean, Virginia, and what date it took place, and it was called the Advanced Theoretical Physics Conference. It wasn't called the UFO Working Group. So John Lear was sort of not really talking about the fact that he was involved in this. Suddenly I put this out, and George Wingfield, who was working on crop circles here in the UK, moved to the United States. He comes up to me and he says, you got the names of those guys on the documents? And I said, yeah. And then Tim Good comes up and he says, oh, you got the name. I hear you got the names. You flashed the names. Can you give me the names of the guys that were on that committee? Suddenly, I get a phone call from Hal Puthoff, who was one of the people, top people who was on this group, and he says, I understand you got a list of names of people of a group that I was rumored to have been part of. Can you send me the list of names? So I said, yeah, I'll send you the list of names. I left off two, the guy whose notes they were, because it was all handwritten and people could figure who it was. And I was told I couldn't release it until the guy died. He's still not died, so I'm hanging on to this. Anyway, now John is saying, well, it was called the Advanced Physics Theoretical Working Group. Suddenly he comes out and says, yeah, I got it right. And he said, but there was no notes. So then I said, well, I made a couple lectures, there was notes. And then the next lecture he'd say, there wasn't supposed to be any notes. So this is the kind of thing that they leaked this to the head of the New York Times investigative reporter because there's no notes. So nobody's going to be able to prove anything. You tell the story of what happened, these guys inside the government, top secret program inside the government looking for UFOs. There's no notes, so nobody's going to find out anything. They didn't realize I had notes. And then I had the cover page, which was classified, and I had the notes. So then they had to sort of backtrack, but that's how they do it. They drop this stuff out. Jamie Chandray, 1991. Oh, he's going, this is the live alien thing. He's going, and they're actually leading him along. And they say that Gates and Kissinger were behind this. And they were, the live alien was still in the United States in 1991, and Jamie Chandray was working very hard trying to go to Washington, and they had this thing in Washington, underground at the mall. And they tell this in a book. It's sort of a real cryptic type stuff. And Chandray just disappeared. Nobody knows where this guy is. He just, after this happened, he just sort of disappeared. But at that point, he and Moore, and if he and Moore believed that live alien was there, and Bob Emenegger was offered the live alien interview, Linda Howe was offered the live alien interview, Whitney Strieber was offered the live alien interview. And when I talked to Bob about it, he said, it's garbage, it never happened. He said, that Moore's just making that live alien crap up. And I said, well, who offered you the live alien thing? And he said, well, Paul Shardle. I said, well, was Paul Shardle reliable? Yeah. And I said, well, then, it never happened, but you were offered the interview with the live alien. And they were offering all sorts of people in the United States the interview with the live alien in the late 1980s. And then in 1991, this thing happens with Jamie Chandray in Washington, and they don't make it, the thing is left or whatever, and that's where the story ends. But Kissinger and Gates are supposedly helping these people put this story out. He's behind the Falcon, he's behind that whole release of material. 1991 disclosure, Richard Dolan talks about this. There's a disclosure in August of 1991. They're going to the president, they're talking about disclosure, they want this out, and it comes down to, they need Gates to be confirmed. I can't remember who the director was, but they said if Gates doesn't get confirmed, they ain't going anywhere. And then the thing gets delayed, and the whole thing falls apart. But there's a lot of evidence that in August of 1991 at Kennebunkport, the presidential retreat for Bush Sr., they were ready to go with disclosure. And if you read Dolan's book, you'll see this. And I've gotten similar stories that confirm that this actually did take place and fell apart. That they couldn't get enough people on board. And it's one of these things where, are we going to do it or aren't we going to do it? What's going to happen if we do it? Like apparently Cheney was against it. He was the Secretary of Defense at the time. Let's try to get to the end here. Ronald Pandolfi. Ronald Pandolfi, this guy is unreal. Tells Dan Smith in 1991, same time, the disclosure thing. Dan Smith gets a hold of him. Dan Smith is a very sort of influential guy. His father was a tax advisor to Eisenhower. He gets interested in crop circles. And so he wants to know. So he phones NASA, he phones all these different people, and somebody at NASA or somebody gives him Ronald Pandolfi's name. Ronald Pandolfi's head scientist at CIA. So he talks to Ronald Pandolfi, and he says, you know, crop circles, I'm interested in this kind of stuff. And he said the very next phone call, Ronald Pandolfi phones him up, and he says, oh, I'm heading over to Los Alamos. I'm going to go talk to the alien. And this alien, this live alien. And so Smith is no dummy, and he's got lots of money. So he phones up Los Alamos, and he says, is Ronald Pandolfi coming there? And they put him on to John Alexander. And John Alexander says, yeah, he's coming. And he doesn't bring up the UFO subject. But that's when it starts, 1991. And Pandolfi says that Dan Smith is his spokesman. And the stuff he puts through Dan Smith is unbelievable. I mean, just all this stuff, because what's the problem is Dan Smith, when he gets on chat boards, he gets thrown off, he's got a temper, he drinks, and somebody says, well, you're not going to believe Dan Smith. I said, well, yeah, I believe Dan Smith. I mean, what he drinks, he's not going to tell the truth because he's not drinking, because he's drinking. And basically, a lot of the stuff that Pandolfi's told Dan Smith has turned out to be true. So for 20 years now, Dan Smith's got this, and if you go to his website, it's called Best Possible World, his site. And if you read the stuff, he had 1,000 conversations. He told me he had 1,000 conversations with Pandolfi, and he asked him all these different questions, and Pandolfi basically tells him this stuff. Talks about Timothy Good was another one. He started receiving a pile of documents. These are the new MJ-12 documents. It's 4,000 pages of documents. So I'm going to sort of skip over this. Timothy Good was getting it. Timothy Good's father was Master Sergeant Harry Cooper. He worked for Art Lundahl at the National Photographic Interpretation Center. When they released his citation from LeMay talking about him working for the UFO program, they spell LeMay's name wrong. So the people that have it, I got a copy of it, but they won't release the document because they're embarrassed because they've spelled LeMay's name wrong. Therefore, it's a phony document. It's a document that's been changed. They want you to know that he worked for Arthur Lundahl, and that's why the documents were going to his son. His son was getting all these documents from different sources. And I'll just quickly go through them. White House. Oh, the White House. That's Pandolfi's called in to brief the President's science advisor, and because the CIA is not involved in UFOs, we don't do UFOs, we can't do a briefing for Lawrence Rockefeller going into the science advisor. We can't do that. It's going to be public. So what does he do? He goes to Bruce Maccabee and he says, I want you to write a briefing for the science advisor to the President. And Maccabee says, yeah, okay. And he writes this briefing, and they try to get it in, and it gets in late. But what they're doing is the guy gets a briefing, and it becomes public, which he did, and it's just a private citizen. Who cares? The guy made up some of the UFO stuff and gave it to the science advisor. That's not a briefing. A briefing is an official guy. What happened is they sent Kit Green in later, and Kit Green gave him the briefing, the real briefing. But they gave him, Pandolfi couldn't get in the position of having the CIA say, we're going to give a briefing on UFOs. We don't have any material. So that's that one. Ronald Pandolfi again, Bruce Maccabee. Stephen Greer gets called, and I'll make one of my last things. Stephen Greer was very much involved in the Clinton administration. He tells the story. He's in Colorado Springs. John Peterson, the guy that had told the woman, do you want to have dinner with aliens? Suddenly comes up, he says, Mr. Greer, I've been following you around, 4 different lectures. I like what you're doing. I think it's time we help you. And Greer says, time we help you? Who's we? He says, well, I guess to start, my friend is the CIA director. And Greer says, well, that's a good start. So he has a meeting, and this meeting has become very controversial, very public. He has a meeting. They bring him in to the CIA director. They have the meeting at John Peterson's house. The cover is it's a dinner party. For 3 hours, Greer talks, and Greer's talking, and he says, Wolseley's almost crying. He's telling him, you got to release the files. You got to get to the bottom of this thing. And so for 3 hours, he talks to the CIA director and Peterson. 4 years later, the thing becomes public. And immediately, the CIA director, Wolseley, and Peterson put out a statement and say, oh, he misinterpreted it. He just took over the meeting. It was just a nice dinner party, and Greer started talking about UFOs. The point is, I don't have a meeting for 3 hours with the CIA. CIA won't even answer my letters. If you have a meeting with the CIA director for 3 hours, they're interested in talking to you. They brought him in. They went to Colorado Springs to get him. Greer did not offer to go. They brought him in. So they're bringing him in, and they want to control him, and they want to give him material. Greer met with the CIA for 3 hours. James Wolseley, that's the one. Here's some more documents. New MJ-12 documents were released, and there's like 4,000 pages of documents. Richard Doty, people say, I say, yeah, 4,000 pages. This is an organization putting this stuff out. And the documents are all phony. They give details. They're controlled documents, but they're telling us what's going on. We have names of people. We have all these different things that tell us what's going on, but the documents are basically phony. Don Berliner gets a document. He worked with Stanton Friedman, wrote a book on Roswell. He gets a document that talks about recovery of bodies. It's sort of the manual of recovering crafts and bodies in 1994. He's an aviation writer. He gets a document in the mail. Disney, 1995, does another documentary. It's only shown in 3 cities at midnight. It was a big controversy. It's like, oh man, Disney's into this thing again. Alien autopsy. I'll leave this for the last one, because this you got to see. This is pretty interesting. Everybody knows the alien autopsy here? It's a British thing. It started in Britain. There's this whole thing about the alien autopsy, and it basically fell apart about 5 years ago. A bunch of guys came forward, said, oh, there's this flat in London. They show the flat. They say, we did it. It was based on old original film. The film fell apart. It's the same thing. It's a stupid story, you know. The original film fell apart, and so we had to do it, so we created this alien. But it was based on the original film that we had that we bought from this guy in the United States. So anyway, the story falls apart. It's a hoax. And everybody still say it's a hoax. But I already knew that Kimball, the Disney guy that I talked about before, had brought in a guy from the United Kingdom and showed him the alien autopsy in 1978 already. Not the same alien autopsy, so I'm going to show you this clip, and that's where I'm going to leave it. And it's basically the same story, that you take this story, you create this sort of a hoax story, you get the alien autopsy thing out, it falls apart, it's a hoax, but it's based on real evidence. And I'm pretty sure they got this off my website, because I had it on there for years, this story about this British guy being brought to the Disney studios and shown this. And here's the clip, and then I'll leave it at that, and some other time, you can hear the rest of the stories. Oh, this is the other thing. They're saying that they created this thing, and you can see on there the alien autopsy, and they said it was done in a London flat. Well, they're called apartments in Canada, but I don't think any London flats or apartments in Canada have a room like this, where you have a window and a little room in behind it. I mean, that's not a London flat. So the story of this hoax is starting to get shaky already. But here's the story of this British guy taken to Disney Studios and shown the alien autopsy. Don Maloney. Hopefully this video works.
An alien appears to lie dead on a U.S. government autopsy slab. For more than a decade, controversy has raged over this infamous alien autopsy footage. So is it real, or is it a fake? With the mystery still largely unsolved, in April 2006, a release of a feature film in the United Kingdom called Alien Autopsy brought a public confession from creature effects wizard John Humphreys that not only had he created the alien in Englishman Ray Santilli's footage, but he also acted as the lead surgeon performing the dissection. Incredibly, Santilli still insisted that he did acquire real U.S. military footage from the legendary Roswell UFO crash. He told England's Sunday Times newspaper that Humphreys merely recreated genuine footage from the Roswell incident that was badly damaged when it was exposed to the air after being stored for decades. Santilli maintained Humphreys was given very precise images to work with. Santilli's story seemed to gain some credibility when Dr. Michael Maloney, honorary fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, came forward and recounted an amazing experience he had years ago as a press photographer covering Walt Disney Studios that suggests real aliens have indeed been filmed.
On the 28th of March 1978, I was invited to have lunch with the executives of Disney. So a car arrived for me and took me to this house in LA, and I sat down in the lounge. It was a very conventional type of home, and they put this projector up and they started to show the film of what I now know is the alien autopsy. I didn't know at the time, and I was fascinated by it. And suddenly you've got all these guys in white coats, a very clinical area, a long table that looked like an old-fashioned operating theatre. I remember a telephone on the wall, a very old-fashioned telephone with a spiral cord. And as the camera moved round, it was filmed by a professional. Definitely filmed by this was not home movies. And it moved around to the operating slab, and there are these specialists, these doctors, surgeons, performing a post-mortem on what looked like a creature from E.T. film. But then the camera, when it pulled back to a wide-angle shot, on the floor in the corner was an identical alien, or whatever looked like an alien, and it was moving. Now, I can only presume that the one that was on the slab was dead, but the one that was on the floor was moving. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. And at the end of it, they stopped the film and said, what do you think to that? I said, fantastic. I've never seen anything like this in my life.
Could it be that the film Michael Maloney says he was shown in 1978 has some direct connection to the alleged reconstructed alien autopsy footage created in 1995? And is the 1995 film released by Ray Santilli somehow patterned after the real thing?
And when I saw it for the first time, I've seen it 3 times now, but when I saw it for the first time, it was very, very similar to the room that I was looking at in March 1978. And I thought, wow, that's the same place. They are the same people, but of course a lot of the original footage that I saw was missing. The alien in the corner, that was missing. And there were a number of little things that were missing that I saw in the original 16mm film. But I can assure you of one thing, that the original film that I saw was brilliant. It was real.
And that's the whole point. He saw the film, but he can't prove anything. It's just a story. They want you to talk. They want you to tell all this kind of stuff. They leak this kind of stuff. They know it's going to fall apart. They're getting the story out. And there's more examples. I just showed you some of the examples. But it's the same thing. And they did it with Chase Brandon. And they'll probably do it in the United Kingdom. So when you see it, get ready for it to get pulled back. Get ready for it to fall apart. But they're trying to get you the story out. And I firmly believe, I've believed for years that that's what they're trying to do. So thanks.